Hey folks, this is Kalani. The patch 8.3 public test realm keeps shaking things up. Buffs here, nerfs there, huge changes to important systems. It just doesn't seem to be settling down right now. That's kind of a good thing now, I think, because some of the features in 8.3 aren't being received all too well. But the dev team does seem to be listening this time around, so the changes that have been happening are super important. We have some more changes to corruption to talk about. The new raid tier is going to have different levels of gear that drops. 8.3 will allow you to transmog legendary items, there's some changes to glowing eyes, and a very special mount will be retiring as we head into the Shadowlands. Let's take a closer look. I want to kick things off with corruption, corrupted gear, and where we are right now in this crazy adventure. The system as a whole can be pretty confusing if you haven't been able to get some hands-on testing done. That's been made a little more difficult in the current version, what with all of the test vendors being removed, but now we have a new UI element that helps explain just how bad your current level of corruption might be. If you have corruption on some of your gear, you should see an Eye of N'Zoth on your character window. You can see things broken down a little bit after you hover over this. We can see right now I have 24 corruption, 12 corruption resistance, and that yields a total corruption value of 12. Now with that 12 corruption, we can see I'll be under the effects of the Grasping Tendrils debuff. This new window also explains what all of the debuffs do and at what corruption level you'll start to experience these negative effects. So you can read that Grasping Tendrils has a chance to slow you when you take damage, and the slow increases as you take on more and more corruption. Then if we ever cross that 20 corruption mark, which I can do by removing my resistance, the corrupted zone effect comes into play. We can see what that effect does as well, and then at the 40 mark we would start to see the Grand Delusion's negative effect. So there's no guesswork anymore with how these effects work, and you don't have to pass one of these thresholds to find out what the next negative effect actually does. And you should be able to pretty easily manage your corruption to stay in a range that you're comfortable with. Don't want the Grand Delusion's creep running after you? No problem, just stay below that 40 corruption mark. Having it laid out like this is much easier to understand, and you know what the next negative effect will be before you cross the threshold to actually experience it. That's not the only change though, there's a new corruption effect when you get to 60 corruption. Cascading Disaster compounds the other three effects into one. After 60 corruption, if you ever get hit by the Grand Delusion's creature, it will immediately trigger both Grasping Tendrils and the Corrupted Zone. So you'd take a huge hit from the Grand Delusion's mob, then be slowed by up to 60 or 70% while in a huge void zone. That's almost a guaranteed death unless you have some strong personal cooldowns, or you have a pocket healer who you've paid to look after you specifically. So it's safe to say that running more than 60 corruption is going to be incredibly dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than the static damage increase and healing reduction that now starts at 80 corruption. Honestly, I don't think people will run more than 59 corruption because of this new effect, and I would be surprised if people ran more than 39 for most types of content. At the lower ends, the slow does practically nothing, and the corruption zone isn't as dangerous as it used to be. At lower corruption levels, you can stand in it fairly comfortably if you have any source of decent healing, and it's not super hard to just step out in the event that your healers are too busy, or maybe just playing solo during world quests and whatnot. I definitely think you're going to see a lot of people run around with too much corruption to begin with, but when they die once or twice, maybe 3 times for the chaps who think they're better than corruption, they'll probably just drop it down to a safe level, because at the end of the day, you don't really gain all that much from some of the corruption effects. Dying because of corruption is also going to put people off faster than anything else. But we do have some other sources of corruption that might be more tempting than the random effects you might have heard about. A lot of weapons have been added into the new raid tier which have special effects and also come with 25 corruption. The effects seem much better overall, at least for throughput increases, although they are still being tweaked and tuned here and there. I think in the latest PTR build, or maybe the one before it, they actually nerfed quite a few of these effects, so they might not end up being worthwhile in the end either. I still think the system has been made too convoluted and complicated for the majority of players to really care about. It's going to be another balancing act, which will require a lot of sims, a lot of testing, and a lot of frustration before you even know whether a piece of gear is going to be worth equipping, or whether you should just cleanse it. I've actually seen a lot of people say that they'll just cleanse the corruption off any piece of gear and ignore the whole system entirely. If you have people saying that they're going to actively avoid a new feature that's being implemented, I can't help but wonder whether it's actually worth implementing in the first place. I guess we'll have to wait and see how everyone takes to it when this goes live. Remember that almost any source of gear in the new season will be able to be corrupted, so there's a high chance you're going to see some corrupted gear no matter what kind of player you are. If you stick to raids, corrupted gear. If you do Mythic Plus, corrupted gear. World quests, the new assaults, corrupted gear can come from almost anywhere. On another note, the new raid tier being introduced with patch 8.3 is going to have 2 different levels of gear that can drop. There are 12 bosses in total, and the first 10 bosses will drop gear as we were expecting, so 445 item level for normal, 460 item level for heroic, and 475 item level for mythic. That's going to be the highest item level that can drop from a variety of sources, that 475, including the new weekly mythic plus cache. However, the last 2 raid bosses, the Carapace of N'Zoth and N'Zoth the Conqueror, they will actually be dropping gear that is 10 item levels higher than the rest of the raid. So that's 455 for normal, 470 for heroic, and 485 for mythic. This isn't the first time a raid has had different item level rewards from different bosses. The Crucible of Storms had different item level rewards from each boss, and it was higher than the current raid tier at the time. Argus the Unmaker also had higher item level rewards in the Antorus raid back in Legion, but there are a few factors that make this raid a bit special. The first is Titan Forging has been removed for patch 8.3. That's going to affect more than just the raid gear. That means Mythic Plus dungeons and the weekly chest have a hard cap on what level of gear they can drop. Previously, you would have had a chance to get an item up to the current Titan Forge cap from any Mythic Plus activity, but that's just not true in patch 8.3. That gives Mythic Raiders a significant advantage over everyone else for the first time in Battle for Azeroth. You can argue whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing until the cows come home, but this is the first season where it will be the case. The other significant difference with this raid is the corrupted weapons. You probably won't be surprised to hear that the corrupted weapons are spread out quite a bit among the bosses, and some of them do come from the last 2 bosses while others don't. I'm going to assume that almost every corrupted weapon in the raid will be the best in slot for whatever class can use it. The only drawback is the corruption, which will be dealt with by a legendary cloak fairly easily anyway, so you can always use one corrupted weapon without really having to worry about corruption at all. Some of the effects on these weapons are heads and tails above the other random effects you can find on corrupted gear, so if you're only going to equip one corrupted item because you don't want to deal with any negative effects, the weapons are probably going to be first on the list for a majority of classes. That means if your weapon comes from the last 2 bosses, it's just automatically better than any of the weapons that come from the first 10 bosses. 10 item levels is a big jump, especially if your class scales well with weapon damage. Just in case you're curious, the weapons that come from the last 2 bosses are the DPS Strength 2-handed sword, the Agility dagger, and the Intellect 1-handed sword. So the play DPS and the rogues will certainly be happy with this development, but I wonder what kind of impact that might have on the class meta going forward. Now, I don't care too much about the meta myself, but I've seen a lot of knock-on effects from the top players being vocal about certain classes being good or bad. It certainly made pugging as a Shadow Priest quite difficult a few patches ago. There are also trinkets and Azerite gear included in the loot tables, which are all 10 item levels higher, so it's not just the corrupted weapons that could end up being a bit of a problem. What do you think of the last 2 bosses dropping gear that's 10 item levels above everything else in the raid? Now that's most of the big news out of the way, but there are some really cool extra features coming in patch 8.3. We were told at BlizzCon that we'll be able to transmog legendary items in the next expansion, and while that's pretty awesome, it's not quite as awesome as being able to transmog legendary items in patch 8.3. It looks like this particular feature will be shipping a bit earlier, because if you hop on over to the PTR right now, you should be able to transmog your favourite orange weapons and armour. That means you'll be able to dual wield your Thunder Furies or set up your favourite sword user with some Warglaives. You can transmog Shadowmourne, Taragosa's Wrath, the Rogue Daggers from Kata, you name it. If it's orange, you should be able to transmog it in patch 8.3. Now, class restrictions do still apply, so if you can't equip the legendary, you won't be able to transmog it, but that should be kind of expected at this point, I guess. This does include the legendaries from Legion, but most of those didn't have unique transmogs, so they're probably not quite as interesting as some of the older legendaries. Hopefully they'll continue this trend forward, so any new legendaries that are thrown into the mix will be transmoggable either in the current expansion, or at the very least the expansion afterwards. Probably a minor thing for most people, but with the promise of being able to actually show off these weapons constantly via transmog, more players might be interested in completing them or starting the required quests. It's one thing to go through all of the hassle of farming a legendary for it to sit in your bank or bag and only ever be a vanity item, and it's another to complete it for the sole purpose of using it as a transmog. I might actually go finish up all of the legendary quests that I got bored of. Taragosa's staff would look amazing with some of my transmog sets on my mage. That's one more thing to keep me busy until Shadowlands comes out. While we're on the topic of new customization options, patch 8.3 will also be changing something kind of interesting relating to eyeballs. If you play a Blood Elf, or a Night Elf, or a Death Knight, or anyone else with glowing eyes, which, let's be honest, is probably half of the people listening right now, you might notice a difference in your eyes when this patch goes live. Instead of the glow sort of coming from the outside of the eye, causing a large full beam type glow effect on the eyes, it's going to be a bit more subtle. The glow kind of comes from inside the eye with the changes in patch 8.3, which makes it look quite different. I imagine this will probably be a bit hit or miss with players, but personally I think it's an improvement. It's less in your face and it looks like the eyes are glowing instead of trying to light up the darkness. The effect works particularly well on Death Knights, but whether you like this change or not, it's really nice to see Blizzard are paying some more attention to the aesthetics of our characters, and apparently this is only the beginning. The Shadowlands expansion will be completely revamping the character creation process to include untold additions to how we can customize our toons. I'm super excited to see what lies in store for us. And then the last bit of info we have for right now is something you might want to think long and hard about. The reins of the mighty Caravan Brutosaur will be retired and become unobtainable from the usual vendors when the Shadowlands expansion launches. That means you have the rest of Battle for Azeroth and no longer to decide whether or not you want to pick this mount up for your personal collection. Obviously, one more mount is always nice for anyone who wants to collect them all, but the Brutosaur is arguably the most convenient mount that we have in the game right now. It has an auction house on it. I don't really think anything is going to be able to beat that in the future, and if you wait until after BfA is over, you won't be able to get this mount reliably at all. So if you were thinking to yourself, you know what would be awesome? Having an auction house on my mount. That would be perfect. But it is a lot of gold. I can just wait until the next expansion to buy it. That's not going to be possible. You'll need to farm up the 5 million gold required to purchase this bad boy before the next expansion launches. If that's something you're aiming for, you now have a deadline. But don't worry too much. In Shadowlands you can still acquire the Brutosaur mount from the black market auction house. That's obviously not an ideal way to pick up this amazing mount, and chances are if it does pop up on the black market auction house, it will go for a lot more than 5 million gold. When mounts become unobtainable outside of the black market, they tend to get very, very pricey. If you think you can handle the 5 million gold grind, you have until the Shadowlands expansion releases to get your Brutosaur purchased. And that's all we have for this week's little roundup of WoW news. What do you think of the corruption changes? Will you be one of the chaps who just turns the entire thing off so you never have to deal with it? Or you play things dangerous and try to squeeze every little benefit out of your corrupted gear and then die time and time again because you get caught by everything and just explode? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.